Right, hi guys, it is Dan here, and today I'm going to do part 3 of my bookshelf tour. This is the last of the fiction, so there's some real good fantasy here. Obviously T is for Tolkien, he's in there, and also I've got a big alternate history series that, well, I'll go through. I highly recommend that, and some, Arthurian stuff, King Arthur stuff, historical fiction. Anyway, get right into it. Right, so we're back up to the top shelves now, and first up here I've got a 1-inch rounding plane by Ray Isles. Use it for like making dowel ends on things. And then we've got some ancient Greek historical fiction, Memnon by Scott Oden. And then some historical fiction about the Albigensian Crusade, Destiny of Fire by Zoe Oldenburg. Then we got Animal Farm by George Orwell, and Survivor by Chuck Palahniuk. And then we're on to a bit of historical fiction by Sharon Penman. First up, Here Be Dragons. Then Falls the Shadow. And lastly, Lionheart about King Richard I. And then we got a bit of post-apocalyptic fiction here. We've got The Deadlands by Benjamin Percy. And then we've got Daniel Polanski's fantasy duology, The Empty Throne. Firstly, Those Above, and then Those Below. Then we've got a few Terry Pratchett books here. We've got the first Discworld novel, The Colour of Magic. Then Equal Rights. Then Weird Sisters. I mean, how awesome are all these covers, by the way? And then we've got Sorcery, which is one of my personal favourite Discworld novels. We've got Pyramids, Guards, which is another favourite of mine, Masquerade, Wintersmith, and then Good Omens, which was co-authored with Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Then we've got some ancient Greek historical fiction by Stephen Pressfield, Last of the Amazons, and some ancient Macedonian historical fiction by Stephen Pressfield, The Afghan Campaign. Then we got the Northern Lights trilogy by Philip Pullman. First up, Northern Lights. Then The Subtle Knife. And lastly, The Amber Spyglass. Some more Roman period historical fiction. We've got Empire, Wounds of Honour by Anthony Riches. And also by him we've got Empire, Fortress of Spears. Then there's The Men Who Stare at Goats by John Ronson. And then we've got some really excellent fantasy that I am currently rereading at the moment on audiobook, so you can check out my audiobook vlogs for sort of thoughts about this. Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, the first book in the Kingkiller Chronicles. And also by him we've got The Wise Man's Fear. Then a bit more historical fiction about the New Forest, I think, Edward Rutherford's The Forest. We've got The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Then we've got a few fantasy novels by Brandon Sanderson. First up, the first entry in his epic fantasy series, The Stormlight Archive. That is The Way of Kings, that's part 1. And that's part 2, because these are the UK editions and it was split up into 2 volumes because it was so massive. And then we've got his Mistborn trilogy. First up, The Final Empire. Then The Well of Ascension. And finally, The Hero of Ages. And next up we've got the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. I'm currently reading through this one, so I've got a few reviews up for this, and keep an eye out for the channel for reviews for the later books in the series. First up we've got the opening collection of short stories, that is The Last Wish, and the second collection of short stories, Sword of Destiny. Then we've got the first actual full-length novel in the series, Blood of Elves. The second novel, Time of Contempt. And the last one that I currently own, Baptism of Fire. Right, so moving on to the next shelf. First up we've got my old-fashioned mortise gauge and my new-fashioned Veritas marking gauge. Then we've got some like really creepy medieval horror, which is pretty good, I thought. The Black Chalice by Stephen Saville. Then we've got Roma by Stephen Saylor, obviously about the Roman Empire. And more Roman historical fiction, we've got Stephen Saylor's The Judgment of Caesar. In a similar vein, we've got The Eagle's Prophecy by Simon Scarrow. and Invader by Simon Scarrow and TJ Andrews. Then we've got Manda Scott's historical fiction series about Boudica, starting with Dreaming the Eagle, Dreaming the Bull, Dreaming the Hound, and finally Dreaming the Serpent Spear. And then we've got, under what I think is her pen name, MC Scott's Rome, the Eagle of the Twelfth. Then we have Sir Walter Scott's classic Anglo-Saxon historical novel Ivanhoe. And then we've got the first of a few historical fiction novels by the explorer Tim Severin, and this is the first part of his Viking series called Odin's Child, which is followed by Sworn Brother, and finally King's Man. And then a few books in his series about like 17th century Mediterranean piracy. First up we've got Corsair, then Sea Robber, and finally Privateer. And then we've got one of the books from his Saxon series, The Emperor's Elephant. Next up we've got Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a fantasy novel that I've not got around to reading yet. We've got The Emperor's Blades by Brian Staveley. And then we've got a novel by Neil Stevenson that I'm not exactly sure how to categorise. I mean, maybe historical fantasy or historical science fantasy or something like that anyway. But that is Quicksilver. And then another book by him that touches on some kind of similar themes, I guess, is Anathem. Then we've got George R. Stewart's classic post-apocalyptic fiction novel, Earth Abides. And a couple of books in Mary Stewart's Merlin trilogy. First up, The Crystal Cave, then The Hollow Hills. And then we move on to my S.M. Stirling collection, which is going to stretch over a couple of shelves here because I've got quite a few of his books. He's a US author that normally does either like alternate history or kind of sci-fi stuff, and I'm a big fan of his. First up, we've got the only book in his Draka series that I've got. We've got the first one, Marching Through Georgia. Then we've got Warlord, which he co-authored with David Drake, and this is very much science fiction. And another omnibus edition that finishes off that series, we've got Conqueror. I mean, I guess it's military science fiction really. More in the same series, we've got The Chosen. And finally on this shelf, we've got The Reformer. Okay, first up we've got probably the most expensive tool that I've got just decorating my shelves. I mean, I do use them all as well, by the way. And that is my number 4 Stanley smoothing plane, which was given to me by my uncle very kindly, and I use it all the time. And then continuing with the S.M. Stirling books, we've got the first book in his really excellent Nantucket trilogy, The Island in the Sea of Time. Then Against the Tide of Years. And finally On the Oceans of Eternity. And then we've got the first books in his really, probably his magnum opus, his alternate history series, starting with the Dies the Fire trilogy. The first book is Dies the Fire. Then we've got The Protector's War. And finally A Meeting at Corvallis. I've done reviews of all these 3 books, so you can check them out if you want. And then continuing with that series, which is also known as the Emberverse series, we've got The Sunrise Lands, The Scourge of God, and The Sword of the Lady. Then in hardback we've got The High King of Monteval, The Tears of the Sun, Lord of Mountains, The Given Sacrifice, The Golden Princess, and I'm having to hold this one up, The Desert and the Blade, Prince of Outcasts, and The Sea Peoples. There is one more novel in this series, but I haven't got round to picking that up yet. Then we've got a book of like sci-fi short stories by him, Ice, Iron and Gold, and a series of short stories edited by Steve Stirling, The Change, Tales of Downfall and Rebirth. Then we've got a really original little fantasy book. We've got The Year of Our War by Steph Swainston. Next up we've got all my Tolkien books, starting with my favourite, The Silmarillion. Then we've got The Children of Húrin. And then usually I would have The Hobbit here, but I recently gave that away to someone as a birthday present. So we've got the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Fellowship of the Rings. Then The Two Towers. And finally The Return of the King. I recently read this on audiobook, so you can check out my first audiobook vlog for some thoughts on that. And then finally by Tolkien we've got Unfinished Tales. And then we've got my second and final indie novel. It's more historical fiction, Britannia, The Invasion Chronicles, Book 1 by John Waite. Then we've got the first book in the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks, The Black Prism. I did a review of this that you can check out if you want. Then we've got Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, which is the first volume in the Dragonlance Chronicles. Then I've got a fair few books by Jack White. These first trilogy are historical fiction set during the Crusades, starting with Knights of Black and White, then Standard of Honour, followed by Order in Chaos, and then moving down to the last shelf of the fiction, I've got number 3 Clawhammer and Raybone and Sons Spirit Level there. And then we've got Jack White's series about King Arthur. This is in the order they were published in the UK. So we start with Excalibur. Then we've got The Boy King, The Sorcerer, Lancelot, The Last Stand, Merlin, Pendragon, War of the Celts, and finally The Round Table. And then we've got the first 2 books in James Wilde's historical fiction series about a legendary English outlaw, starting with Hereward, followed by The Devil's Army. Then we've got the first book in the fantasy series Memory, Sorrow and Thorn by Tad Williams, The Dragonbone Chair, and the third book, Siege. Then a couple of fantasy novels by Gene Wolfe. We've got Soldier of the Mist and The Citadel of the Autarch. Then Robin Young's historical fiction series set during the Crusades. First up, Brethren, Crusade, and Requiem. And then a couple of books in his series about the Scottish Wars of Independence. First up, Insurrection, then Renegade. And last up we've got 3 novels by Roger Zelazny. All of them are like science fantasy, I guess. First up we've got Sign of the Unicorn, then 9 Princes in Amber, which I recently reviewed, so you can check that out if you want. And lastly, The Courts of Chaos. Right guys, so that's all of my fiction. I hope you enjoyed that, and it gives you a bit of an idea of the kind of stuff that I read and the kind of stuff you can expect reviews on in the future. Next up, I think I'm going to go into some of the non-fiction that I've got. I've got an awful lot of books on history, on mythology and things like that, so I think that's what I'm going to do next. So if you're interested in that, then check out part 4 of the bookshelf tour.